You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone, welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I'm Dustin, and Tony is with me, and we are here to cover everything from February 17th through March 2nd. We unfortunately did not have an episode last week, but we were kind of waiting for Paramount Plus to announce their stuff, which was after the normal time that we record. So that's what our main focus is on this episode, but we do have a couple of other things. You're going to notice a couple of different changes I want to knock off the bat when it comes to the show notes, if you're paying attention to the show notes. A couple of things. One, the show notes, we have now used the exact headlines from the source articles so that you have a better reference point of the exact headline that was posted. So that's what you'll see in the show notes, as well as on Twitter and our Discord when you see us post those up. Additionally, in the show notes, you'll no longer find trailer links to all of the trailers, mostly because, unfortunately, I don't know if anybody was actually using them in the first place, and it was a consistent amount of work, and the way they show up on social media and things, I'm not sure if it was worth the time that we were putting into using them. So instead, if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, or at least just head over to our YouTube channel, there is a playlist at the bottom that says latest streaming trailers, and they're broken down by the various different streaming services, and they are updated on a regular basis with all of the trailers that are releasing. And if you play the trailer or play the individual playlists for each service, you'll see the latest trailers from those different streaming services. So that is where you will find those in the future. With that, there is a bunch of different service updates we're going to cover first, and then we're going to get into Paramount Plus. So let's begin with some numbers. Roku they have beaten their quarter 4 expectations, and they continue to grow more ambitiously. Part of the announcement is that part of their revenue that they've been bringing in from the advertising, because it's been doing so well for them, that is part of the reason why they're going to start seeking out original content. It's also why they did the deal with Quibi to bring their content over to the service, was specifically because they're in the market for original content, because they have a lot of revenue when it comes to ad-supported content that they have on their service. So by having original content or content that nobody else can find anywhere else, means people will come to their service, use the content, absorb the ads, and then they can keep, it's just a constant cycle of bringing more money in from the ads. But they're doing amazing as far as active users. They're growing leaps and bounds, which is as expected because they are huge. And obviously they have resolved the issues, I should say, with Peacock and HBO Max. So there's no issue why you shouldn't or couldn't have a Roku and absorb all of your streaming apps that are available.
Yeah, this is great news. I'm a big Roku user. I've been a big fan of theirs for a long time, and just seeing their business with the product and how they've grown over the years has just been really cool to see. We've always known that they've been really good at hardware, but to see them grow in the software space, see them grow into the content space and advertising and stuff, to me has been the most interesting part of their growth, and also it's going to be the most crucial for the future. And I think that these numbers show, advertising is the future. There is going to be a little bit of a glass ceiling, of a ceiling with the hardware side of things. People are going to upgrade to the newest thing every so often. However, new content, that's going to draw people in. Recently, I've seen a lot of interesting movies on the Roku channel that it's on my queue of things to watch, but it's I've just noticed throughout the months in the past year or two, it's the Roku channel's really had a lot of good properties, and that's really nice to see. And another thing that I think that that's been interesting that I feel like they're monetizing on is when there's a big event, they will actually stream it. The presidential election, the U.S. presidential election, I remember seeing them linking to different news organizations and showing their content there. And they've done a few other things with different presidential debates and other things for the U.S. market. So it's nice to see that they're finding their niche and what they can impact, what they can, and where they can grow. So overall, it's really good to hear this from Roku. And they had a great 2020, and I'm curious to see if they can sustain this growth into 2021 and further.
All right, so then some more numbers that came out. Discovery, they had their first numbers for Discovery Plus. Interestingly, and I think this could surprise some people at least, is that their service already has over 11 million streaming subscribers, which is well over estimates. They actually stated that they would be reaching 12 million by the end of February, and that means they've gained about 7 million subscribers since December, based off of their different direct-to-consumer streaming subscribers offerings that they have. To be fair, one of the things I keep seeing from people who are actually using Discovery Plus is it's great background content. And I agree with that statement. I personally don't watch a lot of television while I'm working. I listen to music rather. So I could honestly see a bunch of people subscribing to Discovery Plus and using it as background content that you don't have to pay attention to very in depth. It's just not the content that's for me, but it makes perfect sense as to why they're succeeding, because that is why they've always succeeded with all their channels on their normal broadcast channels in the past.
I'm going to be honest, I'm very much surprised by these numbers of, Discovery Plus. Kudos to them for growing, having 11 million subscribers. That's great. But once again, I am a little surprised that happened. Yeah, I think that some people are going to be a little bit caught up in the numbers, and I see one thing that, the free cash flow metric plunged by, $440 million, this past quarter. But, they blame COVID-19. I mean, they just launched a streaming service, and it takes a lot of capital to, start a streaming service and grow. And, they're putting in a lot of content as well. So, that number is not really concerning. I know some people are probably going to look at that, and it's just what it is. I think it's interesting how they noticed the issue with the revenue in terms of like advertising. Advertising has taken a little bit of a dip in international ads and, domestic ads as well. It's interesting how, this business model is based on, part subscription, part ad-based models. And it's, you're seeing it with, Discovery Plus and other streaming services, as well as, 2020 has been kind of a weird year in terms of advertising, and how is that going to affect these streaming services, a lot of them as they launch and as they move forward. I mean, HBO Max, I feel like has noticed this trend, and they've put off their advertising model. It might just be because they don't have their act together and they just haven't formalized their plan yet, but it could also be that 2020 has just been a weird year in terms of the advertising space. And so it's interesting to see how, their take on that just worked, due to that's part of the business model. Overall, congratulations to Discovery Plus. I hope they surprise me in the future.
All right. And then moving away from numbers, there's a bunch of obvious entertainment news that you can find in the show notes. But one of the things that was real big was upfronts, over the past 2 weeks, TV upfronts. And one of the things, obviously, there's tons of projects that were announced. Like I said, you'll find a lot of that stuff in the show notes. But there was one that stood out to me specifically outside of some of the stuff we're going to talk about with Paramount Plus, which is the fact that Warner Media in general has unveiled an ambitious preschool and kids block on both HBO Max and Cartoon Network, and they're planning on having at least 50 originals for the preschool age children by 2023. Now, this isn't really a huge surprise necessarily, specifically because while it's not necessarily a surprise that they're going after children's content and they're going to be ramping up the children's content, I think a lot of people did not assume that HBO Max would be the service that a lot of children would use. However, I would assume that if parents are paying $15 a month, they're definitely going to utilize children's content on the service as well. They've done a good job of establishing profiles right away, having kids content, being able to be rated so that everything that you can basically change, exactly like how Disney Plus has their content age based, so that way, depending on how old you are, you get suggested certain content within the app itself. But it's nice to see that there's a ton of new content. Obviously, HBO is a company, not HBO Max, but HBO years ago made a huge deal with bringing Sesame Street over to the platform, and then in turn the subsequent re-airings would occur on PBS. But Sesame Street was a big bring in to the company to expand HBO Max family at the time, and I think that this new block of programming that they're doing on Cartoon Network, which will coincide with content that will also be available on HBO Max, is huge for the market of parents who want to get more value out of the streaming service and have that. Netflix has been saying for years that the money is in animation, and that's why they've been promising that they're going to do multiple animated films per year and things like that. And we know that in general, and we've talked about this on multiple occasions, content when it comes to kids content on YouTube is extremely popular. And if they can nail this ad content, or they can nail this children's content before they roll out their ad supported version, man, they could be rolling in a lot of money. Let's just say that.
I absolutely agree. It's yes, seeing this article and seeing the amount of content, the amount of money, and just frankly the amount of just time and investment. And like, yes, some places can just say, okay, we're going to create a lot of content, but just seeing the organization of Warner Media really get behind this idea of children's content, it just proves once again, and it proves the obvious, that to have a streaming service, you need to have more than you got to target all the audiences as possible. You can't just target a single one. I think if we were to categorize, I think HBO Max right now, it is definitely leaning more towards targeting, the adults, because it's built out of HBO, and you have a lot of these other shows that primarily are meant to entertain, adults. Like, yes, there are some content that's aimed for younger kids, but just the current state of the platform, it is pretty much centered at that one demographic. For them to survive, for them to grow, they have to target all these other demographics. And if you want to look at Disney Plus is a really good just a comparison, because they both started relatively soon from right now, versus like Netflix, which started a while back. Disney has a crap ton of children's content, and I think that's why they are so far ahead of, I think, a lot of estimates and a lot of people's expectations, because just the amount of kids content that they have. So going back to Warner Media and HBO Max, this is great. Looking at the minutia and looking at this, it is interesting how they've rebranded Cartoon Network, which growing up, Cartoon Network wasn't aimed at all the children. It was aimed more of the middle school age. I felt like it had a little bit more mature cartoons, not a thing like South Park, but just it's a step up from normal preschool cartoons. It was more of a edgier version, I guess, if you look at like the Disney Channel that happened, if I want to make that comparison right now. And it's really interesting to see, okay, that they've rebranded Cartoon Network. It's going to be aimed for all kids. And that's where they're going to push for a lot of their content right there. It's interesting how they now have a preschool initiative. If you look at other cartoon services, like, yes, they clearly, the certain shows appeal to certain different kids ages and kids ranges, but seeing Warner Media actually have a push on the preschool front is pretty interesting. And this initiative is called Cartoonito, which is, I think, a little bit funny, but yeah, it's a whole preschool programming block that's aimed, as a quote, support each child's unique potential. These different shows are going to incorporate the principles of a preschool educational framework. It's called human-centric learning. It was developed by psychologist Dr. Laura Brown, and I think it's just really interesting, the specific deep dive on preschool content, and really going forward to, okay, let's build this out. Here are the principles, because kids are going to watch a lot of content. How can we assure parents and help develop kids? Overall, it was just really interesting to see how full-fledged, Warner Media's approach to the kids and kid animation was. I mean, Dustin, do you think it's interesting that this idea of preschool programming and the human-centric learning educational framework, you don't really see that from other, media companies? Usually it's just, okay, let's just create content that can get eyes on here and really meant to sell toys. But the fact of, okay, let's try to develop essentially a curriculum that is going to support and empower kids, I feel like that's pretty rare.
It is. And when I look at content in general, being a parent and looking at content that's out there, I would absolutely agree, one, with what your statement was about Cartoon Network being geared towards more middle schoolers or older, not necessarily meant for younger children at all. Cartoon Network has never had content outside of like maybe classic cartoons that are just meant for anybody. They've never really had content that's meant for a younger age range. Nickelodeon has obviously had Nick Jr., their block. Disney has had Disney Jr. Obviously PBS has content that's geared more towards the younger crowd, and then there's a channel called Sprout, which is a lot of PBS content that's on cable as well, that also is geared more towards preschool children. children or younger. And the thing is, outside of Sesame Street, between HBO Max, HBO Family, which was the old block of family programming that they had on HBO in the mornings for kids, and Cartoon Network, there really isn't a whole lot of content that has existed outside of some of, like I said, those classic cartoons that really work for younger children. And even the classic cartoons do not have any necessarily educational value, let's say, when with the content they're giving. It's entertaining and children are entertained, but it's not educational. The only content that's really educational that HBO has had has been Sesame Street, which they acquired a while back. So the thing is, ultimately, they've got a huge area that they have the chance to grow, and I think that's really big for them. And I think it's really smart because Disney succeeds at having a lot of content for younger children. The younger children are the ones who probably watch more content than maybe some of the older children. By the time children get a little bit older, maybe they hang out, maybe they start playing video games, maybe they're involved in sports. They're not necessarily watching things as frequently as younger children might be. So I think that when it comes to this, it's very, very important for them to hit this block. And maybe the other part of this is that maybe they were looking at their content offerings. I remember they had that, everybody has that quadrant of male, female, and then age range of how old the ages are. And they're probably looking at their quadrants of demographics and thinking to themselves, okay, where do we have? And if I remember correctly, HBO Max was supposed to answer the question of, here's a lot more content that's geared towards females and not necessarily males, because HBO content already is kind of leaning towards older males. And they had content, obviously, that works for children, but not necessarily younger children. So I think it's important for them to hit all of the different demographics. That's obviously extremely important. The last thing I just want to talk about with this is, obviously, it just remains the question that remains for me is what happens with the streaming service Boomerang, which is part of Warner Media. It's basically a parking place for an insane amount of kids content that, if you actually look at the content that they offer over there, they have an excessive amount of content that is not necessarily available on HBO Max. And I have to wonder, as I have always stated, how long it will take before that content ends up getting ported over to HBO Max, because while the price point is significantly less expensive than HBO Max, there's a lot of content that could be rolled into HBO Max to add the value to HBO Max for children in general. So the fact that they're spending money on new content, I applaud that, but I have to wonder in the back of my head what's eventually going to happen with Boomerang, because it's literally just a bunch of content that has no other place to be except for right there at this immediate point. And occasionally you'll see content rotate between HBO Max and Boomerang and back and forth, but I have to say it's only a matter of time before I think that content ends up getting ported over. So with that, the last service update we've got is just a quick one. The Apple TV app has officially launched on Chromecast with Google TV. I've been waiting for this moment for a long time, so I'm glad it happened. There's not much more to say other than that. I just wanted to say I'm very happy that it happened. I'm already plotting what shows I'm going to start watching with my wife. I was having her watch some of the trailers for the shows to get her feel on some of them, because I think a lot of them could be really good, at least from what I've heard and what I see, and I'm excited to actually dive into Apple TV Plus in the immediate future. All right, so with that, let's jump into Paramount Plus. So Paramount Plus on the 24th of February unveiled what they're going to do, basically transforming CBS All Access into Paramount Plus, but specifically telling them what it's going to include, the prices, and all of that. So it's officially launching on March 4th. The base price, which is ad-supported, is going to be $4.99. That will release in June. It's not going to release at launch, but at launch, the premium tier, which is $9.99, will launch on March 4th. Both versions will include sports, news, and entertainment. Now, this is enticing for a lot of people, especially the sports, because I think this is, obviously, we've been talking a lot about sports since the beginning of the year and how it plays into these streaming services. service. They specifically say there will be exclusive live sports available, there will be NFL football live, and there will be more live CBS sports content as part of the premium tier. As far as news, they will have the CBS News and CBS News On Demand. There will also be a CBS News Network and live local stations available on the premium tier. As far as entertainment, there will be exclusive originals, thousands of originals, 30,000 TV episodes from CBS, and 30 CBS shows on demand. There will also be live TV as part of CBS on the premium tier as well. So there's a lot of content. I'm not going to get into the specific originals and things like that, but there's a lot of stuff that is huge about this. The other thing that I thought was extremely important to mention is the fact that they specifically said that they have every intention to take all of their Paramount films that release in theaters and to bring them to the service within 30 to 45 days from the date that they release in theaters, which again lowers that theatrical window and gives more added bonus to that thing. They specifically said the immediate films Top Gun Maverick, Quiet Place 2, and the Mission Impossible 7 all are the first group of films that will be releasing on the service within 45 days of them being in theaters. And so let's talk about immediate reactions first. Let me get your immediate reactions before I dive into some of the things that I think are interesting.
I was surprised. I really enjoyed CBS All Access when it was out. Yes, there were some things it just didn't have, but some of the original content was really nice to have, and showed it to my parents, and they really enjoyed that type of content. They always have. They really love CBS, and they found that CBS All Access was great. Now, looking at Paramount Plus, it does sound enticing. I think the biggest thing for me is this theatrical window bit. And I don't know about you, Dustin, but after Warner Media's announcement of, okay, we were going to dual release, the movies in the theaters and then release on HBO Max, obviously up to a month, immediately up to a month, and then the rest of their theatrical window is going to be off the service and it's going to come back eventually. After hearing that deal and then now hearing, okay, yes, it's going to be within 30 days or 45 days of the release in the theaters. To me, that's Warner Media has the edge. HBO Max has the edge, and just hearing like Paramount Plus, it's like, okay. Well, I think that was a really good opportunity to meet the situation. I think HBO Max set the bar, and now these other streaming services are going to have to deal accordingly. And I bet that there's going to be a little sadness by I think the general public of, okay, well, some of these big budget movies. Mission Impossible 7, I love that series. But okay, if I get CBS All Access, I have to wait now 30 days. It's I think it's a missed opportunity there. But overall, the streaming service sounds very compelling. I'm curious to see how it goes. The pricing model is very simple. $5 a month with that. It's $10 without. It's simple, and I like that. Let's talk back again in like 3 months and just see how they've grown. And as long as I'm curious if they can beat CBS All Access, ceiling. I felt for some reason that there was always a ceiling with that streaming service. It was never going to grow past, what it was. And maybe the people at Paramount and CBS, Viacom, whatever the company name is now after all these mergers, Viacom, CBS, if those people took the lessons of CBS All Access and applying them to Paramount Plus, and all right, we know what doesn't work and we're now moving in a different direction.
When I immediately heard what it's going to include, one, I applaud them for having the ambition to include as much as they have. They're going to have live content, which is great. That goes in line with what Peacock is doing with certain things that they have. They have sports. They have NFL. They're actually one of the only ones that have NFL rights on their service. And I think that just is a holdover from the initial deals that they had with the NFL for CBS All Access. The question that I have, and then obviously you've got the movies, which is kind of like what Warner Media is doing. It's just a different version of it. There's a lot of content here in general. And it seems like they're trying to hit all of these different marks of what can we take the best of every single of these services that has launched in the last year. We can put our content on the service within 45 days. That's similar to what Warner Media is doing with HBO Max, but not exactly the same because we don't want to upset anybody at the theaters. They want to have live sports and they want to have live news. Well, Peacock's already doing that. And obviously there's a ton of content in general, 30,000, which, rivals 30,000 episodes by itself on demand rivals a lot of the other services. So I think as far as their ambition as to the content that they will offer, I think it's a great level. I think the price point is great. The other thing that I kept getting frustrated by was the fact that they had already said outside of the States, Showtime would be bundled as part of Paramount Plus, and it would just include Showtime shows. Here in the US, because of the deals in place with the cable providers, they were going to have some other option where you could do it. And now it seems like you're going to be able to add on Showtime to Paramount Plus as an added kind of like an added tier, I guess, where you get added content into it. And I'm not opposed to that, because honestly, as long as it doesn't exceed $15 for the Showtime content and all the CBS content, that puts it right on par with HBO Max, and they have roughly about the same amount of offerings. Paramount doesn't release as many movies per year, so it's not as big of a deal. Nobody's really going to be making a big deal about how they're lowering the theatrical window, unlike Warner Media, who lowered it completely for a year because of the pandemic, which, might I add, the dual releases that they've been doing with Wonder Woman, Tom and Jerry, and The Little Things, those movies have actually performed pretty well at the box office for being the pandemic and being a lot of the theaters are closed. So it's not as if theaters aren't making money off of these films. They are. The real catch is going to be when Raya and the Last Dragon comes from Disney Plus, because that's a big film. It's on Disney Plus for that premiere access, but it's also supposed to be in theaters, and we'll see how well that does. But anyway, back to Paramount Plus. I think that they're definitely trying to check a lot of boxes, and it'll be interesting to see if they'll be able to maintain everything that they're trying to do. The advantage is they don't have their news aspect of CBS has always been on broadcast, which they control. They don't have to worry about cable channel or cable providers getting upset because CNN content is being offered on HBO Max like Warner Media would have to. They can have CBS News run all day if they want, because they control CBS News. It's not airing on any sort of cable channel. Same thing with CBS Sports. It's the exact same thing. So I think ultimately it's smart for what they're trying to do. They're trying to check a lot of boxes to be kind of the place to go to get a lot of content. The Showtime thing would be the smartest thing to like bring inside the fold in some way, because if they were to bring it inside the fold, they could be offering not as much necessarily, but higher quality content that is, that is comparable to some of the content that HBO offers. And I think that would be really good for them, because while they offer a ton of content on their broadcast channel and the other channels, none of the content super stands out amongst a lot of things. I will say that some of the shows that they have on their normal broadcast station are some of the best shows that do very well when it comes to licensed shows on Netflix, is because that's just how it works. So I think ultimately they're checking a lot of boxes. They're going to try to be the one-stop shop that a lot of the streaming services are. It's nice that they already have sports deals in place because of CBS Sports, that they can bring that stuff immediately into the fold. That's stuff that unfortunately Peacock has had to slowly start building. HBO Max, who knows what their plans are with sports, and the other ones that they're doing what they're doing. So I think that's where I'm at as far as what I think. Now, the one thing that I want to kind of end the Paramount Plus talk about is there was a couple of news bits that came out during the upfronts, specifically that Netflix is going to be creating Transformer and My Little Pony shows, animated shows that are branded with Nickelodeon, and that Amazon is going to be working on a live-action G.I. Joe series centered around Lady J. And I have to say, this is a very important thing to bring up when it comes to Paramount Plus and Paramount Viacom CBS as a whole, is that they already have existing deals with a lot of different streaming services. Nickelodeon has a deal in place with Netflix to have not only content come to Netflix from Nickelodeon, but also to have content to create original content for Netflix that's not necessarily on Nickelodeon. And that's a very interesting thing. There's also a deal in place with Paramount to create content for Amazon. That's where Jack Ryan came from. That's where this G.I. Joe series will come from. There's a couple of other projects that are in place that fall in with Paramount as well. And if you remember correctly, back when before HBO Max launched and we were talking about HBO Max and Warner Media as a company, Warner Media makes a lot of content for other providers in general, not necessarily streaming services, but they've been making content for years and years and years for broadcast channels, cable channels, streaming services. They've been making a lot of content. And one of the things that we always questioned was whether or not they could find that fine line of still creating, good content that they could sell to other providers, but also create original content that does very well for themselves to bolster HBO Max's offerings. And obviously they have figured it out to a degree because they are still creating content elsewhere. They're still creating more original content as they ramp up production on things for HBO Max originals. Paramount is in the exact same boat in the sense of they already have these existing deals in place, some of which are going to keep some of their content away from them for a while. Some of the popular series on Netflix, some of the most popular series on Netflix are currently CBS or Viacom CBS shows that would otherwise be on HBO, would otherwise be on Paramount Plus, but instead are going to be on Netflix for the foreseeable future. So there's a reason why they just announced they're going to be doing a reboot or a new version of Criminal Minds. It's because consistently Criminal Minds is one of the top shows on Netflix and they don't have access to that show for a while. So they're going to create a new one for Paramount Plus. It's one of the reasons why one of the new shows they announced was bringing Rugrats back is in a new form for Paramount Plus, is because some of the Nickelodeon content that is really popular is sitting over there at Netflix. They're going to reboot iCarly, which was another show that's done very well on Netflix. So it's just important to note, when you get to the larger studios, Disney is very self-contained. They don't make a lot of content outside of them, outside of what they brought in recently with Fox. They don't make a lot of content for other studios. When it comes to Paramount or Viacom CBS and Warner Media, they make a lot of content elsewhere. NBC Universal, they don't make they make a good amount of content, but again, they're not making content necessarily as widespread as Viacom, CBS, and Warner Media. So their content that they're making is a lot of it's in-house for their own stations and things like that, but they're not necessarily making a lot of content for other avenues. So I just want to bring that up because I think it's an interesting point where I think ultimately there should be a lot of comparisons in the long run between Paramount Plus and HBO Max when, as far as the successfulness of them goes. CBS All Access is going to be the foundation of how Paramount Plus gets to be a significant player in this game immediately, but then it has the ability to go international as well. All right, so then to wrap up the entire episode, there's just one final note. This isn't necessarily streaming related, but I think it's worth mentioning just because we've talked about this in the past. So it was announced that AT&T is spinning off DirecTV, AT&T TV Now, and Uverse into a new company that they're valuing at $16.25 billion. We've talked about DirecTV and how their subscriber rates keep going down, and how does AT&T continue to bleed that and, not worry about investors coming at them. And we all know that based off of their three tiers of focus, wireless was one, internet was one, or internet in general, fiber internet, and then wireless, and then HBO Max was the other one. Those are the main tiers that they're focusing on. As far as pay TV, they're not focusing on that as much because there's just not the long-term growth that they need for that to be successful. So they have an investor that has actually come in to buy part of that new company, to have a chunk of that company. And I think ultimately it's going to turn into, those things could end up being completely spun out and have nothing to do with AT&T, and then AT&T just strictly focuses on internet, wireless, and then obviously media with Warner Media and HBO Max and things like that. But I just thought it was worth mentioning because we've talked about HBO Max's success somehow being linked to the fact that DirecTV exists and AT&T Uverse exists, and this AT&T TV Now thing that they tried multiple different versions and it never really took off. And if they separate it, maybe there's a little bit better chance for them to potentially get more sports things that aren't related to the pay TV side of things, or there's maybe a better option for them to have live channels necessarily on HBO Max that they wouldn't have had to if they were competing against themselves when it comes to these other pay TV options. So just worth mentioning.
This was, I think, really good news to hear. DirecTV, it was a good acquisition at the time. It made sense. But now it's just been a huge drain on AT&T's side as they're moving forward with the new direction with, Elliott Management, coming in, being definitely way more hands-on as an investor, just trying to push the company to, cut costs, handle debt, move forward, get rid of business lines that just don't really make sense. AT&T had to do this deal. Just DirecTV was just, holding them down. It just made sense. Sometimes you have to move forward, and I think it is clear the many different levels of leadership at AT&T and HBO Max and Warner Media. Let's do the things that we're good at and leave behind the things that we're not, and let's reorganize around this principle. So it makes sense. I think on the show we've talked about how this is something they should do, or do something about DirecTV in terms of it's just been dragging them down, and I'm glad that they've taken the steps to spin this off as a company and just move forward. I think it's just sad if you look at the numbers and the amount that they paid to acquire DirecTV, and then just the amount of the three businesses that they put together to spin off into their own business was, I think, like three orders of magnitude smaller. It just shows how much money the DirecTV unit and AT&T Uverse, all those things have just lost AT&T in general. So it makes sense that it could be its own company. Hopefully that company could be successful at just what it does and not be bothered and burdened by the rest of the AT&T business.
Absolutely. With all of that being said, that's going to wrap up this episode of The Streaming Wars. I implore you to head over to our website, thestreamingwars.io, to check out the show notes with all of the other news that is released over the past 2 weeks. Be sure to check out our YouTube channel for all those trailers that have also released over the past 2 weeks and continue to release into the future. In addition to that, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and you can join our Discord for all latest news. Instagram is where we will find new announcements related to podcast posting. In addition to that, you can send us an email at thestreamingwars@gmail.com with any questions, comments, concerns, or topics you'd like us to discuss on future episodes, as well as leaving feedback, or you can leave feedback wherever you are listening to this podcast. That is always greatly appreciated. With all of that being said, for Tony and myself, this has been The Streaming Wars, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to The Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also, consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.